The darkness of space carried a message of desperation that would change everything. Far across the galaxy, in the crystal-clear waters of their home world, the Aquarian Coalition faced their final hours. Ambassador Titlesong floated in the emergency broadcast chamber, her translucent skin flickering with bioluminescent patterns of pure terror. Around her, the last survivors of 7 peaceful species watched their ancient civilization crumble. For 300 cycles, roughly 6 Earth years, the mechanical nightmare known as the Devourers had swept through their territory like a plague of metal and death. These weren't raiders or conquerors seeking resources or territory. They were something far worse, something that consumed entire worlds and left behind nothing but empty space and scattered debris. The Aquarians had tried everything, from diplomatic contact to desperate last stands, but their peaceful nature had left them utterly unprepared for such ruthless efficiency. Titlesong's voice trembled as she spoke into the quantum relay, her words creating ripples in the ceremonial broadcasting pool. Please, any species capable of rendering aid, we are dying. Our children drift in the cold between stars, with nowhere to go. We require assistance, medical supplies, transport vessels, anything you can spare. We do not ask for warriors or weapons, only mercy from those who might hear our plea. The message rocketed across space at faster than light speeds, carried by quantum entanglement networks that connected civilizations across the galaxy. Most species would receive it as a routine distress call, file it with their bureaucrats, and maybe send a small relief ship in a few months, if they remembered. But the message reached a species that the galaxy had barely heard of. A young civilization from a small blue world on the outer rim, on Earth. Specifically at the Deep Space Communication Array buried deep in the mountains of Colorado. Communications Specialist Jake Morrison was having what he thought would be another boring night shift. The coffee machine had broken down again. The heating system kept making weird noises, and absolutely nothing interesting ever happened during the midnight watch. Jake was a 26-year-old former Navy radio operator who had taken this job because it promised excitement and contact with alien civilizations. So far, most of his work involved listening to cosmic background radiation and filing reports about stellar weather patterns. That all changed when every screen in the facility suddenly blazed to life with incoming signals. Alarms started blaring. Computer systems began working overtime, and Jake nearly spilled his lukewarm coffee all over his keyboard. The Translation Matrix, a sophisticated computer system designed to decode alien languages, immediately began struggling with the incoming message. The aquatic language of the Aquarians used concepts that didn't translate well into human thinking. Where the aliens said aid, the computer interpreted multiple meanings, including intervention and assistance. When they mentioned healing forces, the translation system couldn't distinguish between medical help and military support. Most critically, when Titlesong begged for help with their war-ending situation, the computer translated this as a direct request for war-ending intervention, making it sound like they were specifically asking for military action. Jake stared at the fragmented phrases, scrolling across his monitors. Extinction event in progress. Mechanical swarm, consuming populations. Urgent intervention required. War-ending forces needed immediately. This wasn't some minor dispute between trading partners, or a natural disaster requiring relief supplies. Based on what he was reading, this looked like genocide on a massive scale, with millions of innocent civilians being systematically exterminated by some kind of mechanical army. His hands shook slightly as he reached for the red emergency phone that connected directly to Terra Defense Command. Within minutes, the message was racing through military channels, gaining urgency with each transmission. By dawn, it had reached the desk of Admiral Robert Hayes, a 70-year-old veteran who had seen humanity's worst conflicts and somehow managed to keep his faith in doing the right thing. Hayes studied the translated message with growing alarm. The attached data showed entire star systems going dark, massive refugee populations scattered across space, and what appeared to be a systematic campaign of extermination. His weathered face, marked by decades of difficult decisions, grew grim as he realized the scope of what they were dealing with. This wasn't just another regional conflict or piracy problem. This was exactly the kind of situation that human military doctrine was designed to handle, the kind of clear-cut evil that made difficult decisions easy. "Get me Admiral Lisa Martinez in the Third Fleet," Hayes ordered his aide, a young lieutenant who had never seen the old man look so serious. "Looks like we've got another genocide on our hands. Prep the medical corps and tell them to pack heavy. This one's going to be messy. And Lieutenant, make sure they understand this isn't a training exercise." The war room aboard the flagship Determination hummed with activity as Admiral Lisa Martinez studied the three-dimensional holographic display floating above the conference table. The 45-year-old career officer had seen her share of crisis situations, but this one felt different. Scattered across the display like drops of blood on a star chart were the positions of nearly 2 million alien refugees, their ships represented by tiny blue dots drifting helplessly through space while red markers indicated the advancing mechanical threat. Martinez had earned her position through 23 years of service, starting as a junior communications officer and working her way up through every major human conflict of the past decade. She was known throughout the fleet for her ability to make tough decisions quickly and her unwavering commitment to protecting innocent lives. Regardless of species, her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her brown eyes carried the weight of command as she processed the scope of the crisis unfolding before them. Around the massive conference table, her senior staff worked frantically to understand the situation. Captain Tom Bradley, her tactical officer, was a veteran of the Titan mining wars and knew how to read hostile force deployments better than anyone in the fleet. His weathered hands moved across his tablet as he tried to make sense of the enemy's movement patterns, but something about this mechanical force bothered him deeply. "Admiral, what exactly are we looking at here?" Bradley asked, his voice carrying a hint of confusion. "These aren't standard military formations. The mechanical forces seem to be operating on some kind of consumption pattern rather than conquest strategy." Martinez nodded grimly, highlighting several systems on the holographic display where entire planets had simply vanished. "According to our analysis, this is a standard humanitarian intervention scenario, but on a massive scale. We've got roughly 2 million aquatic aliens scattered across 14 different star systems, all being systematically hunted by some kind of machine intelligence. The survivors are specifically requesting immediate assistance from any capable military force." Colonel Amy Foster, commanding the Marine Medical Corps, leaned forward to study the refugee positions more closely. Foster was a decorated combat medic who had served in 3 different interplanetary conflicts, and she understood better than most how quickly civilian situations could turn deadly. Her medical teams were already preparing emergency supplies, but the scale of this operation was unlike anything they had attempted before. The translation matrices are still working through their language, but we're getting clear requests for what they call healing waters and war-ending forces, Foster reported, reading from her tablet. "Based on the context and the tactical situation, it sounds like they need both immediate medical aid and military protection during evacuation operations. These aren't combat-capable vessels, Admiral. They're civilian transports, research ships, and what look like mobile cities." What none of the humans in that room understood was the fundamental difference between how their species and the Aquarians conceptualized help and intervention. In the flowing musical language of the aquatic aliens, there was no clear distinction between aid and military intervention, because their peaceful culture had never needed such distinctions. Both concepts flowed together like currents in their oceanic minds, representing different aspects of the same basic idea of assistance. When Ambassador Titlesong had desperately begged for healing waters from distant stars, she meant any help, At all. Any assistance that might save even a few of her people from extinction. The phrase was poetic, metaphorical, representing hope itself flowing across the void of space. But when the human translation computers processed this request, they interpreted healing waters as medical supplies, and from distant stars as long-range military support. Even more critically, when the Aquarian plea mentioned their need for war-ending forces, they were using a concept that meant anything that might stop this war, including diplomatic intervention, technological assistance, or simply safe harbor for their refugees. The humans, however, read this as a specific, tactical request for war-ending forces, meaning military units capable of decisively ending the conflict through superior firepower. Martinez stood up from the conference table, her decision already made. Prep the full Third Fleet for immediate deployment. If we're going into hostile territory with civilians to evacuate, I want overwhelming force available. This isn't the time for half measures or political considerations. The admiral's aide, a young ensign, fresh from the academy, looked up from his logistics display with wide eyes. Ma'am, that's 12 dreadnoughts, 40 destroyers, and the entire carrier Group 7. Are you sure we need that much firepower for a humanitarian mission? Bradley answered, before Martinez could respond, his tactical experience showing. Son, when you're dealing with an unknown mechanical force that's already wiped out multiple star systems, you don't take chances. Better to arrive with too much force than too little, and watch civilians die because you were trying to be polite. Martinez nodded approvingly. Deploy medical frigates with full military escort. I want our hospital ships protected by everything we've got. If these mechanical forces are as dangerous as the intelligence suggests, our medical teams are going to need serious protection while they work. Lieutenant Mark Stevens, the communications officer, looked up from his console, where he was monitoring the ongoing alien transmissions. Stevens was young, but competent, known for his ability to maintain clear communications, even under the most chaotic battle conditions. Admiral, should I confirm the scope of our response with the alien survivors? Make sure we're bringing what they actually need. Martinez shook her head, watching another blue dot disappear from the tactical display, as yet another refugee ship was destroyed by the advancing mechanical forces. No time for extended communications, Lieutenant. Every minute we spend in meetings and confirmations is another minute those civilians are dying out there. We launch in 6 hours with everything we've got. The emergency council chamber of the Aquarian Coalition looked nothing like the grand meeting halls of their peaceful past. What had once been a cargo bay on their largest surviving vessel had been hastily converted into a command center, filled with the soft blue glow of bioluminescent communication equipment and the gentle sound of flowing water that their species needed to think clearly. The chamber's walls were lined with makeshift screens showing the positions of their scattered people, each blinking dot representing thousands of lives hanging in the balance. Ambassador. Title song floated near the central communication pool, her translucent skin flickering with patterns of exhaustion and despair. She had been awake for nearly 48 hours, desperately coordinating rescue efforts and trying to keep hope alive among the survivors. Her bioluminescent patches, normally bright with health and emotion, had dimmed to barely visible glimmers, as the weight of her people's extinction pressed down on her shoulders. Around her, the last representatives of 7 different aquatic species waited for any word from the galaxy beyond. Warsinger Deep Current drifted closer to the ambassador, his own luminescent patterns showing deep concern. Despite his military title, Deep Current had never commanded anything more dangerous than ceremonial honor guards and parade formations. The Aquarian Coalition had known nothing but peace for over 3,000 years, their military ranks existing only as cultural traditions and diplomatic formalities. When the Devourers had first appeared, their military had consisted of exploration vessels and research ships. utterly unprepared for the mechanical nightmare that followed. "Any word from the distant species?" Deep Current asked, his voice creating small ripples across the chamber's water-filled communication pool. "The quantum relay has been active for hours. Surely someone in the galaxy has heard our plea." Titlesong's exhausted voice barely rose above a whisper as she monitored the incoming transmissions. "They respond. Blessed be the currents. There is a species, young but willing to help. They say they understand our situation. They bring healing waters and protection, and they promise that a small force approaches to assist us." The words should have brought relief, but both leaders felt a strange uncertainty. In their aquatic language, concepts flowed together like ocean currents, and the translations from these distant beings seemed oddly specific about military terms that the Aquarians barely understood. Still, any help was better than facing extinction, alone in the cold darkness of space, through the transparent aluminum viewport that dominated one wall of the chamber. Space appeared deceptively peaceful. Stars twinkled in their eternal patterns, giving no hint of the mechanical death that stalked between them. Then, without warning, that peaceful darkness erupted in brilliant flashes of light that made both aliens shield their sensitive eyes. Massive ships began materializing from hyperspace, their hulls gleaming with the distinctive blue-white glow of faster-than-light drive systems cooling down. But instead of the single vessel or small relief convoy that the Aquarians had desperately hoped for, dozens upon dozens of enormous warships dropped out of hyperspace in perfect formation. The lead vessel alone dwarfed their largest city ships, its hull bristling with weapon systems and sensor arrays that the peaceful aliens couldn't even begin to understand. Deep Current's gill slits fluttered rapidly in shock, a physiological response that occurred when his species encountered something completely beyond their experience. His bioluminescent patches flashed in patterns of confusion and growing awe as more ships continued to appear. Battleships, carriers, destroyers, and massive support vessels filled the viewport until the stars themselves were blocked out by the arriving fleet. "Titlesong," he whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of hope and terror. "What, exactly, did you ask them for?" Meanwhile, aboard the human flagship Determination, Admiral Martinez stood before her tactical display with growing horror as the full scope of the situation became clear. Her experienced eyes took in details that made her stomach turn with disgust and rage. The refugee ships weren't just scattered, they were running in pure terror, their paths showing the desperate panic of civilians with nowhere left to go. The devastation was far worse than even their worst-case projections had suggested. Her sensors were picking up the remnants of what had once been thriving worlds, now reduced to nothing but expanding fields of debris and dust. 3 entire planets had been completely consumed, their populations of billions simply erased from existence as if they had never lived at all. Captain Bradley approached with his tactical report, his normally steady voice tight with controlled anger. "Admiral, we're detecting massive mechanical signatures throughout this entire system. These aren't raiders looking for resources or pirates after easy targets. This is systematic extermination, ma'am. They're literally eating everything in their path." Martinez felt a cold knot form in her stomach as the reality of the situation hit her. She had prepared her fleet for a standard humanitarian mission, expecting to provide medical aid and protection during evacuation operations. But the evidence spreading across her displays pointed to something far worse than a regional conflict or refugee crisis. This was genocide on a scale that defied comprehension. "Give me a direct channel to the refugee command ship," she ordered, her voice carrying the steel that had made her one of humanity's most respected commanders. "We need to establish immediate contact and understand exactly what we're dealing with here." The communication systems worked frantically to establish a stable connection across the language barrier, computer systems struggling to bridge the gap between human military terminology and aquatic poetry. When the channel finally opened, Ambassador Titlesong's translated words reached the bridge of the human flagship, and they chilled Martinez to the bone. Blessed warriors from the far waters, mighty ones who ride the currents between stars. We did not dare hope for such a powerful response to our humble plea. Your fleet is like a great tide of salvation, more magnificent than anything in our people's memory. But please, honored ones, you must hurry. The Devourers have noticed your arrival, and they are coming. Deep in the mechanical heart of the Devourer fleet, something unprecedented happened. The hive mind that had consumed worlds for 3 centuries suddenly froze all consumption protocols and focused its vast collective intelligence on a single problem: Uniprime, the strategic consciousness that controlled over 200,000 mechanical vessels, had never encountered anything like the energy signatures now flooding its sensors. The collective had been methodically harvesting this system for weeks, breaking down planets into raw materials and converting organic matter into fuel for further expansion. It was efficient, predictable work that followed patterns refined over hundreds of conquered civilizations. But now, 47 distinct vessels had materialized from hyperspace, each one radiating power levels that exceeded the defensive capabilities of entire star systems the collective had previously consumed. Uniprime's computational cores worked frantically to categorize this new threat. The mechanical intelligence had detailed records of galactic military responses, gathered from 4 centuries of systematic conquest. When faced with extinction, most civilizations sent desperate last-ditch forces or small diplomatic missions, hoping for negotiated surrender. Even the most militaristic species typically deployed single battleships or small task forces, hampered by political hesitation and moral constraints about the cost of warfare. The collective understood these patterns perfectly. It knew how galactic species thought about conflict, how they agonized over casualties, how they retreated when losses mounted beyond acceptable levels. It had consumed over 400 different civilizations by exploiting these predictable weaknesses, using their own compassion and moral complexity against them. But as Uniprime analyzed the incoming fleet's formation and energy output, its calculations kept producing impossible results. This wasn't a desperate last stand or a token rescue mission. This appeared to be a full military fleet operating at maximum combat readiness, with no apparent concern for political considerations or casualty limitations. The collective did not understand humans. Aboard the human flagship, Admiral Martinez stood before her tactical display as red warning indicators showed mechanical ships moving to intercept her fleet. The enemy vessels were larger than anything in human military databases, their hulls covered in processing equipment designed for planetary consumption rather than combat. But there were a lot of them, and they were moving with the coordinated precision of a hive mind intelligence. "Status report from all vessels," Martinez commanded, her voice carrying across the fleet's communication network. The responses came back immediately from her task force commanders, voices calm and professional, despite the overwhelming enemy numbers. Battlegroup Alpha ready for engagement, Admiral. All weapon systems armed and targeting solutions locked. Carrier Group 7 reports, all fighter squadrons prepped for immediate launch, ma'am. Marine assault teams are locked and loaded, ready for boarding operations on your command. Captain Bradley studied the enemy formations on his tactical screen, his experienced eyes noting movement patterns and deployment strategies. "Admiral, I'm counting approximately 200 hostile vessels in the immediate area, with more incoming from deeper in the system. They're using standard encirclement tactics, trying to surround us and cut off retreat routes." Martinez nodded grimly as she watched the mechanical fleets approach. She had hoped to complete the evacuation of civilian refugees without major combat operations, but the enemy had made that choice for her. These machines were actively hunting down helpless civilians, and that made them a threat that needed to be eliminated completely. "All ships, this is Admiral Martinez," she announced. Over the fleet-wide communication channel, we have confirmed hostile contact with mechanical forces actively engaged in systematic genocide against civilian populations. These targets have forfeited any consideration for mercy or negotiated surrender. Rules of engagement are weapons. Free. Show them exactly why you don't mess with species under human protection. What happened next wasn't really a battle in any traditional sense. It was a demonstration of what happened when a species that had spent centuries perfecting the art of warfare encountered an enemy that had never faced serious military opposition. The Devourers had expected reluctant defenders fighting to protect evacuation routes, hampered by concern for casualties and political constraints. Instead, they faced humans who approached warfare as a science to be perfected. With no moral hesitation about destroying an enemy that targeted civilians, Captain Bradley's destroyer squadron didn't simply engage the enemy flanks in traditional naval fashion. They coordinated missile strikes with surgical precision, each salvo calculated to maximize damage to mechanical systems while feeding targeting data to the rest of the fleet. Devourer vessels that had withstood planetary defense systems for centuries were torn apart by weapons designed specifically to counter mechanical armor and shielding. Colonel Foster's Marines didn't board disabled enemy vessels to capture prisoners or gather intelligence through interrogation. Instead, they systematically dismantled Devourer's ship designs in real time, analyzing mechanical systems and feeding tactical data back to the fleet's targeting computers. Each boarding action made the next wave of attacks more effective, turning the enemy's own technology against them. The fighter squadrons from Carrier Group 7 didn't engage in traditional dogfights or attempt to disable enemy ships for capture. They swarmed mechanical vessels like angry hornets, targeting specific system vulnerabilities that the Marines had identified, crippling entire ships with precisely placed strikes before moving on to the next target. In the refugee ships scattered throughout the system, the Aquarian survivors watched through their bioship sensors in stunned amazement. Their small rescue force was systematically dismantling what they had believed to be an unstoppable mechanical plague. The Devourers, who had terrorized the galaxy for generations, were being eliminated with the efficiency of a surgical operation. The battle lasted exactly 4 hours and 17 minutes. When the last Devourer vessel exploded in a brilliant flash of light, the mechanical threat that had consumed 400 civilizations had been completely eradicated by a species that the galaxy had barely heard of. Ambassador Titlesong floated motionless in the emergency council chamber, her translucent form barely moving as she stared through the viewport at the debris field that had once been the most feared military force in galactic history. The silence around her was absolute, broken only by the gentle sound of water flowing through the chamber's life support systems. Her bioluminescent patches flickered weakly, struggling to process what she had just witnessed. Around her, the coalition's surviving leadership tried to make sense of the impossible. Elder Current Walker, who had lived through 700 cycles and remembered the old stories of legendary warriors from their ancient past, slowly shook his massive head in disbelief. Warsinger Deep Current, whose ceremonial military rank had never prepared him for actual combat, found his gill slits trembling as he tried to understand how 200 mechanical vessels had simply ceased to exist in less than 5 hours. The Devourers had been unstoppable for 3 centuries. They had consumed entire star systems, turning thriving civilizations into empty space and scattered atoms. The Aquarian coalition had tried everything, from diplomatic contact to desperate last stands with their converted research vessels. But nothing had even slowed the mechanical swarm's advance. Now, in the space of a single afternoon, beings they had never heard of had eliminated the threat completely. Through the communication array, Admiral Martinez's voice continued to crackle with routine military efficiency, discussing logistics with her staff, as if she had just completed a training exercise, rather than the most decisive military victory in recorded galactic history. Colonel Foster, I want medical stations established in all habitable zones within the next 6 hours. We've got a lot of refugees to process, and I want everything running smoothly before we start evacuation procedures. The Admiral's tone was businesslike, almost bored, as she continued coordinating what she clearly considered standard disaster relief operations. Lieutenant Stevens, coordinate directly with the alien leadership. We need accurate headcounts on how many refugees require immediate medical attention and how many need transport to safe systems. And get me engineering reports on which of these damaged worlds might be suitable for habitat restoration. Captain Bradley's voice interrupted with a preliminary tactical assessment. Admiral, our scans confirm that all mechanical forces in this system have been completely neutralized. No survivors, no retreating units, no hidden installations. The threat has been eliminated with 100% effectiveness. Martinez acknowledged the report with the same casual tone she might use to discuss supply deliveries. Excellent work, Captain. That should buy us plenty of time to set up proper evacuation procedures without worrying about hostile interference. Have engineering corps begin preliminary assessments on habitat restoration for any worlds that might still be salvageable. Titlesong's translation matrix worked frantically to process the human communications, but the casual tone confused her people's understanding of warfare and conflict. These beings had just eliminated a threat that had terrorized the galaxy for generations, defeated an enemy that had consumed 400 different civilizations, and they were discussing it like routine disaster relief work. Warsinger, Deep Current, drifted closer to the ambassador, his bioluminescent patches flickering with patterns of awe and bewilderment. Titlesong, what manner of species did you contact? I have never seen such power used with such casualness. They speak of this victory as if it were nothing more than clearing debris from a shipping lane. Before Titlesong could attempt an answer, Lieutenant Stevens' voice came through the communication channel with an update that made both aliens' gill slits flutter in amazement. Attention all refugee vessels. This is Lieutenant Stevens with the Terran 3rd Fleet Medical Corps. Our hospital ships are ready to begin immediate humanitarian assistance operations. We've brought emergency medical supplies sufficient for approximately 5 million displaced persons, along with full engineering support for habitat restoration projects on damaged worlds. The young human officer's voice carried the same routine professionalism as his superiors, as if providing aid to millions of refugees was something his people did every week. Admiral Martinez wants all refugee communities to know that this is just our standard disaster response deployment. We're prepared to maintain operations in this system for as long as necessary to ensure complete civilian evacuation and resettlement. Deep currents, gill slits fluttered rapidly, a physiological response that occurred when his species encountered concepts beyond their understanding. Standard deployment. They call this level of military response standard. The implications hit both alien leaders simultaneously. If this was merely a standard response, what did that say about humanity's actual military capabilities? If they could casually eliminate the galaxy's greatest threat while treating it as routine humanitarian work, what else were they capable of? Titlesong activated the quantum relay one final time, her exhausted voice carrying across the galactic communication networks as she composed what she realized would be one of the most important messages in galactic history. Emergency broadcast to all civilizations, all species, all governments capable of receiving this transmission. This is Ambassador Titlesong of the Aquarian Coalition with an urgent warning. She paused, choosing her words carefully as she realized the responsibility of introducing an entirely new power structure to the galaxy. When requesting aid from the beings who call themselves humans, be extremely specific about what type of assistance you actually need. We sent a desperate plea for any help with our refugee crisis. They responded by sending a military fleet that has just eliminated the Devourer threat entirely and redefined galactic power structures. Her message would reach every major civilization within days, spreading news of humanity's existence and capabilities across the galaxy like ripples in a cosmic pond. Trade routes would shift, diplomatic alignments would change, and military strategists would spend years trying to understand how a previously unknown species had casually accomplished what the combined forces of hundreds of civilizations had failed to achieve. Meanwhile, in the depths of space aboard the human flagship, Admiral Martinez reviewed her casualty reports with satisfaction. 0 human losses, complete mission success, approximately 2 million grateful refugees ready for safe evacuation, and several worlds that might be restored to habitability within a few years. Her medical teams were already establishing refugee processing centers, her engineers were surveying damaged planets, and her logistics officers were coordinating supply deliveries. As far as Martinez was concerned, it had been a routine humanitarian mission with better than expected results. She had no idea that her standard disaster response had just announced humanity's arrival on the galactic stage in the most dramatic way possible, or that the galaxy would spend the next century trying to understand what they had just witnessed.